Well, to be completely honest with you, Diane, I did not expect that much of a turnout for Project Hail Mary, nor the amount of Roanoke. Why Astrophage and not Rocky? You know, the creature the movie is basically about? And while I agree with you, you have to remember, you're a dork. And with this knowledge, there appears there was maybe enough interest in man's best rock friend, so let's get to it. Under what conditions can life feasibly form? While we may be biased to believe that carbon-based life is the ultimate answer, there are different forms of compounds that are actually quite stable at higher and lower temperatures. The standard from what we can reckon as a species, at least on this rock, is carbon and water. This is what forms us and all the life on this planet. However, there are ranging chemical difficulties to basically make these things even moderately plausible. Things like carbon and ammonia instead. With this one, the temperature would likely have to be much lower, which in turn would very likely slow down the rate at which life would change and evolve. And this could lead to longer lifespans, but less changes. And then you have things like carbon and methane, or how about carbon and some CO2? Not doing it for you? Well, what about carbon and sulfuric acid? Or even the most famous of all, silicate-based life. These different structures of life would require different atmospheres that would be incredibly hostile to one another, but as you may have guessed, perfect for any life that would form in that environment. Now, this is not to say concerning today's video that somehow man and rock are all that different, because realistically, way down to its core, we're not. So I think what we should do is let's first talk about the planet Erid in the first place, and what conditions existed which would then kick off its own evolutionary pathways as life would adapt to what humanity would consider to be quite a hostile environment. Granted, Earth to an Iridian is also equally hostile. But first, this episode is sponsored by Factor. I'm going to cut currently, and you know what has been lifeblood? Factor, with their fresh, never frozen, chef-curated and dietitian-approved meals delivered straight to my door. They're instrumental in not only meeting my protein goals, but also making sure I get the proper nutrition that I actually need. During this cutting of weight, the one thing that I've wanted to do was maintain lean mass, if at all possible, while losing fat. But going the double protein option, I have actually been able to consistently get between about 175 to 200 grams of protein a day, all while still being in a deficit. This means my lifts have gone up, all while working towards, hopefully in the next few months, getting abs. It is the South down here, those will be necessary still in September. But more importantly, the meals are healthy, meaning I have more energy, more focus, and in general, just I feel better. Maybe that much protein isn't your thing though, or maybe you're just too busy. Well, they offer vegan, veggie, keto, protein plus, and several other options, and I mean, there's something for everyone. But considering you only need to put these bad boys in the microwave for like 2 minutes before having that fresh, never frozen meal, what's stopping you from eating healthier today? Yourself! So don't do that. So if that sounds good to you, then head to factor75.com or click link below and use code ROANOKEFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor Box plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code ROANOKEFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. ROANOKEFB50 at factor75.com. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. So let's start pretty much from the beginning, shall we? Erid. Erid is an exceedingly dangerous place for humanity if you don't live in the Thunderdome and have gravity quite literally altered. Erid contains roughly 2.09 gravity of what Earth is, or 2.09 Gs, I guess is the best way to put it. In fact, interestingly enough, how they were even able to develop a space program with these kind of constraints is nothing short of miraculous, given that it would be twice as difficult than what humanity had to deal with. If a human were to live on Erid for an extended period of time, assuming you were the standard 180 pounds in the base freedom units, or if you want to be unique and special for some reason and use metric, which why would you ever want to do that? That would be roughly 81.6 kilograms. You would almost immediately have to contend with the fact that your weight has quite literally doubled because you are on that planet. So congrats. Dr. Now will be seeing you shortly, as your new weight would be roughly 376 pounds, or just about 170.5 kilograms. Or if you're really about the weird measurements of life, that's 26.8 stone. That's right, I looked that one up. It's not just a weight issue at that point. Your body is designed to move blood around you at 1 G. A little over 2 G, your heart could compensate, but it is going to have to work much harder to pump that blood from your legs. If you have leaky valves within the legs, then forget about it. Those are backtracking severely, increasing the risk of deep vein thrombosis or blood clots forming in general. Moving would cause an extreme need for more ATP than normal, as every step is much heavier. It's likely tunnel vision would also begin to form. And I guess get comfortable with it because this would be the norm, and dizziness is just going to be par for the course. In order to move in this gravity, shuffling at 25 like a 90-year-old is essentially the only way to get around. Your neck would become tired from even holding up your head. Even with your spine technically holding up your head, your muscles are just going to be like, yo, I'm out. And most horrifically of all, you could feel the weight of your organs in your abdominal region. However, it's not all bad. Your meat suit would actually start sporting some fancy new adaptations by a few weeks in. In order to overcome the leg blood clot issue, your blood vessels would contract quite aggressively, raising blood pressure but allowing for blood to flow more smoothly. Now, this puts the heart under even more strain, and you better hope there's no weak points in your brain, known as aneurysms, as well, that would become detrimental quite rapidly. The nervous system would adapt within this time frame, allowing for more forceful muscle contractions in order to move, which in and of itself is bizarre that our bodies would be able to adapt to this constraint. I mean, really think about it. We just exist in 1G. In nature, there really shouldn't be anything that standardly increases that for any reason, but our bodies can adapt, which is very strange. And also, if you were unaware, concerning muscular contractions, if you first start at the gym, you'll find you get stronger before you start getting bigger, and that is because your nerves will actually start, or your motor neurons specifically, will start recruiting more muscle fibers to actually contract. So your body kind of likes to do it the lazy way first before investing in muscle. It's like, well, yeah, but can we contract what we have more forcefully by just maybe innervating it a little better? So things like that. But apart from more forceful muscle contractions, the bone density, more so in the long bones, will increase considerably, likely doubling in response to the continued extra pressure. This is good and bad. Bad because if you jump into a body of water, you are even less buoyant than usual, and the gravity is higher, so you're likely going to drown. Continual response to the new environment would also mean that muscular mass would increase, as living in this area would require the formation of stronger muscles. Now, also, going back to the bones for a minute, you're not going to be living long out here. So on Earth with 1G, you always hear about how the elderly will like fall and break a hip. That's not usually what happens. What usually happens is the head of the femur becomes so weak that they take a step and it just snaps, which then causes them to fall and then causes them to break their hip. So that's going to probably happen to you at like 40 if you're living on this planet. But what I want you to think mostly about with all this is the skeletal system in the body. Because while its density increases, the major issue is going to be the joints. Your knees are going to be absolutely toast. Those things are only marginally designed to last 30 years. Mine hurt all the time now. So it's not like a human couldn't contend with the gravity, but this would significantly decrease your lifespan due to the pressures put on the body by just existing in this environment. Higher blood pressure, probably to hypertension levels, more ATP, which then requires more caloric intake in order to even move, the body working to process those nutrients in a more laboring environment. Every breath, even as you lie down and try to sleep, is more difficult. There would be virtually no rest for you. So take all these parameters and now apply them to a different species, and you can see the need for much more alien adaptations. Erid also possesses an atmosphere that would be critically hostile to humanity, and the reality is, it is actually boxed in the species there given how stable it is, which is kind of ironic. Humans on Earth have to deal with a lot of different variables when it comes to our planet. The tilt of Earth, the aphelion versus perihelion when orbiting the sun, the axial precession of this rock in which every 25,000 to 26,000 years Earth traces a circle, which changes which summer on which hemisphere is closer to the sun. Right now, it's Australia just getting blasted. But this has created life that, while it requires a certain atmosphere, can actually exist under varied situations, allowing it to exist in a wider range that maybe other species are not. Erid is difficult by a long shot, but it's also different. Apart from its double gravity, it's kind of almost what is considered, I guess, to be a super Earth, having 8 times the mass of Earth and 16 times the detail. Anyways. Also, did you see Todd Howard get absolutely spanked? I don't know what's going on at Microsoft right now, but that one gal they got up there, she put the pressure on that man. Anyways, the radius is about double Earth, and the atmospheric pressure is 29 times what Earth has. Instead of oxygen and nitrogen, the atmosphere of Erid is composed primarily of ammonia, and this has had some interesting impacts on the life that would form there in the first place. Now, the issue with Erid is its extreme pressures. Actually, this causes the species to evolve there to be incredibly stable, as I have mentioned. Seems a bit paradoxical, but let me explain. Erid not only has all the aforementioned dimensions, try saying that 3 times fast, but the temperature on this planet is around 410 degrees Fahrenheit in bald eagle units, or around 210 degrees in Celsius, which is cringe. This high temperature is partially inspired by its atmosphere, given it's 29 times what Earth is. This denseness, however, will allow for liquid water to exist on the planet without boiling. Greg, pull up a phase diagram of water. The triple point is where it's actually really interesting, given it's a gas, liquid, and solid all at once, or it cycles through that. But as pressure increases, so does boiling point as well. So what you have on Erid is water that can be superheated without boiling away like it would on Earth. In fact, the boiling levels on Earth, if you go high up in the mountains, it's less because there's less pressure. If you go down near the sea, it's more. So that's why there's actually 2 sets of instructions on certain things that you have to boil. So essentially, you can have a lot of the same processes of that planet happening as it would on Earth. However, the heat levels would just be higher. And here, pressure is an interesting thing when it comes to the formation of compounds, because this means it falls well outside of what we would expect life to form as. But the pressure of other molecules prevent life itself from falling apart, well, at least at the seams, due to the heat energy. It's pretty fascinating stuff, actually. So it's not just at the pressure of the atmosphere, but also when we look at Erid, we see it is incredibly close to its sun. Only about 0.224 AU, AU being astronomical units. 1 AU is the distance from the sun to Earth on average. Why did we choose that, you may be asking? Well, because Earth is important to us and we needed a system of measurement to measure distances of planets apart from miles and kilometers, because I don't know about you, but I cannot even begin to conceptualize 93 million miles. That means nothing to me. But this means Erid is actually only 20.8 million miles away from its sun. For reference, Mercury is 36 million miles away from its sun, and this means Erid is almost only about half the distance from its own sun that Mercury is from our sun. And this is incredibly close to a nuclear fusion thing. So if Erid were in our solar system, the coronosphere here, not sure why I mispronounced that, of our sun would extend about 5 to 8.5 million miles into space. Erid would almost be touching the coronosphere of our sun. In order to contend with this issue, the magnetic field of Erid is 25 times more powerful in order to block incoming radiation. In fact, speaking of radiation, Erid is pretty much virtually untouched by it, which created a problem for spaceflight. No light energy makes it down to the surface of Erid, which means down there, it's basically like where the anglerfish live on Earth. However, the Iridians were smart and annihilated those things, I am more than certain, because they too understood they don't deserve to live on the same planet as the Iridians. And so they were destroyed. Humanity is lagging behind. Hashtag nuke the anglerfish. But because of this lack of light energy being, like them being aware of it, Iridians never evolved to know that it was there in the first place. So they essentially didn't understand it was something of a speed limit. When they put together their ships in order to head to Tau Ceti, in order to find out why it wasn't dimming, but all the other stars were, they assumed they could just keep accelerating endlessly. Instead, they didn't have an understanding of relativity. I mentioned this in my video covering the Astrophage, which, by the way, that was basically the video over Project Hail Mary until, like, everybody and their mother wanted me to cover this. So go watch that. But essentially, we are no more than, like, 10 light years away from any given point. However, the issue is it's light years by the person's traveling, I guess, reckoning. To an outside observer, time will still pass more normally. And while they are moving faster as you approach light speed, light speed, time slows for you, but continues on as normal for others. The Iridians didn't know this, and given their insanely powerful magnetic field on Erid, and their lack of understanding concerning radiation, because virtually none would reach the ground apart from heat energy, which was stable from pole to pole, they had no real counters in space to protect themselves, which almost led to the end of their species due to their failed mission. But with that, I think we have an understanding of the conditions of Erid and why it would create this very specific species built for a very specific environment. Because remember, the temperature is stable the entire place. The pressure is stable the entire place. The entire world, I guess is a better way to say it. And it just has an extreme magnetic field. But the reality is, Rocky's people and anything that formed on Erid are basically all extremophiles. These are cells, much like those that are found to exist around hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the sea, that can exist near the boiling temperatures as they feed on the minerals coming out. But how exactly does this allow for life on Erid? It's sort of a similar process as to what we assume may have happened on Earth, pressure and temperature. Except this time, there was likely not that much distinction between like the dense, soupy atmosphere and the oceans of Erid. Now, this is based on a hypothesis of life, and really hasn't been confirmed because well, the blunt truth is, as a species, we just don't know exactly how we came to be on this planet or how the leap from inorganic to organic began. But the assumption is, deep within the oceans, the hydrothermal vents were pumping out tons of minerals. The most common being copper, iron, and zinc. Some gold and silver are in there, as well as cobalt, calcium, beryllium, silica, and many others. But as these materials were dumped into the frigid ocean waters, they would cool. Sometimes, by random chance, lightning would then strike the oceans, and this would form compounds that would then quickly break apart. However, it's assumed at some point these compounds would form, and some of them might even be stable. As these stable compounds formed, they would actually link up with other stable compounds, and then, allegedly, the first organic compound was born out of this by random chance. Now, this organic compound would then link up with other organic compounds that would then, eventually kind of go on to form life. Now, obviously, the thing that stands out with this thinking is, A, why do we not continue to see this happen? 2, where are the new forms of life that should be springing up, or at least something that we've never seen before kind of spring up down there like a new cell? And D, how does an organic molecule make the leap to life? All very interesting questions, but again, it is a hypothesis, not confirmed. It's really something that we'll probably spend our entire lifespan as a species trying to figure out. But the reality is, we had no idea why this process started, and then suddenly, now all of a sudden, within the last billion years, it just doesn't do it anymore, and how did we come out of it? So for that, people turn to religion typically, but this process, if correct, means this is likely what happened on Erid, but instead of the compounds falling apart due to extreme temperatures, which it should have, the pressure of the atmosphere would hold them together, which would then allow for them to follow a much similar pathway. Any less pressure, and the oceans boil away. Any more pressure, and it may have been too much, but this would ultimately result in the formation of the first cell on Erid, which likely existed in the atmosphere shortly after, as the ecosystem of Erid was quite complex with many forms of what would be considered a bacteria here on Earth existing within Erid's atmosphere. But what's interesting is how life would divert itself into a different pathway presentation on Erid as it would on Earth. On Earth, the leap from single cell to true multicellularism has a bit of a mid-step that was born out of necessity rather than just because. As life continued to form on Earth, eventually some of those cells would realize, that's a generous statement, they would just sort of start preying on one another for resources, given that the other cells have exactly what they need. Eventually, single cells would start banding together in order to deal with this issue of predation, and then they began to form colonies. These colonies are not true multicellularism. They would typically be related cells that would then go on to form like a clump of biofilm that could keep out predatory cells and even capture nutrition from the environment, which, as you might imagine, would increase their fitness and allow for those that banded together to continue reproducing and surviving. But eventually, something here would shift. It is unknown how it happened, but much like the changes in animals and plants on Earth over time, at its core, cells would change. The leap from prokaryote to eukaryote is a profound and useful situation, as the acquisition of legs is to fish. More complex organelles, a dedicated area for DNA to be held, the DNA becoming more large and complex, coding for more information, the ability to engage in epigenetics, which would later be critical for true multicellularism, and this would all arise leading to us. Our cells rely on one another to form us, and without those cells, they do not survive. More protection, more resources, but at the cost of being able to live singularly in case the other cells die. Now, cancer is a tremendous biological douchebag because of this, because it can exist by itself, yet it uses the systems, nutrition, and type stuff, which this is unconfirmed, obviously. I'm not telling you this is a situation, but something I read recently was essentially talking about glucose and cancer. And one of the things they found is that glucose, obviously, cancer is addicted to glucose. It needs it needs a ton of it, and that's what ends up kind of, decreasing people's ability to survive. Now, if you have cancer, you need to go get treatment. That's just flat out, right? You need to go do that. Do not eat 12 pounds of, bluebell peppers every day. I don't even know bluebell is a thing. That's ice cream. Anyways, peppers every day. Eating 18 pounds of carrots isn't going to fix it. Really, at that point, you're having some issues. But allegedly, preventatively, maybe fasting possibly has been shown that it could potentially rob maybe precancerous cells of enough glucose before they go full cancer. So possibly one of those things of fasting every once in a while could be helpful. Now, don't put my head on a pike in the comments. I understand it's not a cure for cancer. It's not going to prevent everything under the sun. It's not going to fix everything. but it's just something that is being investigated to see if possibly that could be something that helps prevent cancer. So obviously more information is going to be needed, but it's an interesting thought process nonetheless. But anyways, now back to on Earth. So basically our cells, they need other human cells in order to survive, because if they're not in a system, we've tried keeping human cells alive in labs, it doesn't do very well. So this pathway is how complex life on Earth continued, which then resulted in humanity. On Erid, it seems like the process was progressing in a similar manner. However, the colony route would be invested in more heavily for one reason or another. Whereas the colonies of cells on Earth are more protected than, like, say, a free-living cell, their coordination is much more stunted than true multicellularism. The Iridians appear to show that's, like, at least what happens if the colony route continues and maybe was invested in more heavily. And to understand the internal structures of Rocky, we must first understand not only these structures, but the rest of his physiology, because it is built with a very specific purpose in mind. The immense pressure, the higher gravity worlds, and the complete darkness that a species would evolve over time in. So, we all know where we need to begin with this one. Starting with the hand-feet things, there are 5 of them, ending in what can be assumed to be very similar to fingers, just with little less dexterity, given it's basically inorganic and they're made of rocks. There are 3 fingers in total per limb that can open and close, resulting in the ability to grasp things and only give the thumb down symbol. The reasoning behind the dexterity issues will be discussed when we cover the internal anatomy of this species here in a few minutes, and actually how they move in the first place. Each of these limbs essentially is an exoskeleton made of various minerals that forms similar to how shells form on creatures on Earth. Interestingly, they will also end up shedding their shells as they grow, indicating there's a layer down there actually secreting this material that becomes the shell. The 5 limbs will attach to a 5-sided thorax, and overall, they're not very large, standing at roughly 1.3 feet in height, which comes out to around 50 centimeters in heathen units, I suppose. And this is due to a multitude of reasons. First, it's not really known what sort of predators may exist and who could have hunted this species, or what maybe they hunt, but given his species eats more calorically dense food, with time in between feedings being much longer than humans, it will appear that the Iridians will actually eat other organisms on their planet, not just plants. Now, this nutrient, kind of constraint can make them smaller, but also the immense gravity means they will not get very tall. But anyways, on their planet, this means they are in fact carnivores of sorts, with the material being consumed being likened to dense meat as it's described. Interestingly, there are areas of his body in which, the area in which he eats is not really like a mouth that is open all the time. Instead, they literally have to make what our species would consider to be a wound in order to eat food. And this is due to the ever-present issue of the atmosphere. You simply cannot have that softer portion of the body continually exposed to the atmosphere and the ammonia within, as this will result in catastrophic issues, even for the Iridians. They're not supposed to have that much ammonia in their body. The limbs themselves are able to be fully extended, like when they learn to hug, which will make them much taller and successful at hugging, which, as we know, is a human classic. Interestingly, you think that given the psychology of the species and their intense social bonds that they form, they would have already developed this. But much like how primates can hug for warmth and security, the Iridian species will choose to sit on one another when they sleep, which is like an awake hug rather than, one comatose and one awake, I guess. But given their carnivore status, they were clearly hunters, at least to a degree, which these limbs can then fold up, and they can actually become a ball-like structure, which then allows them to roll. The outside of Rocky's body is adorned with carvings into the exoskeleton itself that will allow him to communicate by rubbing his limbs on his other limbs, but there also appears to be a sensory organ of some sort, possibly embedded into the limb structures as well, because, it's in the rest of the carapace and they need to see, but we'll get there. These areas are what allow the Iridians to actually see. Given the planet's atmosphere is so thick that no light reaches the surface, this means that their evolution was based on purely echolocation, but not in a general sense. Usually echolocation will bounce off creatures, which will give an animal here on Earth kind of a simplified view that something is there and moving based on the incoming sound waves that have been bounced back. However, this is not the same with Iridians. When they send out sound waves, which is all the time actually, much like how our eyes are also always absorbing incoming information, the Iridian biology will have several different sound waves coming in at different times that they have put out. The difference in time and pitch will functionally show that what kind of is going around or going on around them, right? Like, let's say you're walking and you're an Iridian. So as you emit these sounds, right, you can know what's in front of you because that's going to come back higher pitched because of the Doppler effect and you're moving towards it. Whereas what's behind you will also be lower pitched because you're moving away. Now, if something behind you and you're emitting sound, or I guess there really is no behind the Iridians, but if something is behind them moving towards them, then it will sound higher pitched and their brain will know it's coming towards them. Whereas if something's in front of them and moving away, even though they are trying to get like closer to it, it will still be further and further away. So the Doppler effect will actually make it sound lower pitched. But this is what shows is around them, and not in like a, oh, something is there, but in a 3D rendered way. And this is much like how the human brain works. The reality is, if we took what we call sight and completely wiped away the brain's like interpretation of what we were seeing versus just the raw incoming data, everything looks blurry and overstimulating concerning colors. Our brains will do a lot of the heavy lifting, because that's their literal job, and fill the gaps in what we are seeing and then take shortcuts, which is why we see what we see. The Iridians have similar neurology. They will have constant incoming sound signals around them. These are likely well below what would be infrasound for humans, so Grace would hear nothing and it wouldn't actually like disturb his brain that he was hearing it, but it's mapping the area and the brain interprets it as a 3D model, allowing the Iridian to see. And this will also allow for them to literally hear a human talking across the ship because we are producing our own sound waves. So given the dense atmosphere in their homeworld, we can then assume sound also travels better, meaning that likely they would have a better view of their world, but I do wonder if it would get annoying. You could hear your neighbor several miles away, probably, given it likely acts how sound waves move in the ocean. Now, taking a step back and looking at the macroorganism before moving into the internal anatomy, it's important to remember, like the dead skin of a human, what you are seeing isn't necessarily the being itself. Most of Rocky is actually inorganic. The exoskeleton, while secreted by cells, is just a covering. Embedded in that covering is going to be like pores and some pieces of himself, at least with what's somewhat exposed. When they almost critical mission failure out near Adrian, Rocky exiting out of his hamster ball shows that the much thinner atmosphere of Earth literally causes him to begin outgassing as he's not used to that pressure. This means anything near the surface quite literally begins to boil away. The same thing happens when humans ascend too quickly after diving. The nitrogen in our blood will form bubbles because it's coming out of the tissue, which we affectionately call the bins, which is not good because that can actually straight up cause a, not pneumonia. What is the word I'm looking for here? An embolism. I don't know why I thought it was pneumonia. Anyways, probably because the pulmonary vein. Whatever. But basically, that's when nitrogen bubbles build up in your bloodstream. So, and also in your joints, and it's incredibly painful, and it will kill you. So Rocky's biology has the same thing happen, given that the immense pressure of his planet causes the compounds in his body to stabilize. Without that pressure, it begins to fundamentally break down, which means the outgassing. So as we move into the internal anatomy of the Iridians, things get more and more strange because of the absolute hostility of the planet. You can think of the Iridians like a creature with a hard candy shell and like a nougaty center. The actual being is not a truly multicellular creature, just below the actual exoskeleton, but instead a collection of what are essentially worker cells. Now, this is not to say the colony they have formed is not successful or somehow worse than a multicellular creature, but instead has become much more complex and successful over time. The reality is that Rocky's body is actually composed of only a few pounds of biological cells, or a few kilograms, if you want to look at it that way. I know. I love when it's vague because I don't have to investigate exact values. All right, well, I investigated the exact value. It's not vague, really. Rocky is said to be 300 kilograms, but having roughly 22 to 23 kilograms of living tissue. So he's living that my 600-pound life at 661 pounds, but actually only weighing about 48 to 50 pounds. Anywho, yeah, so essentially, here's how it functions. The organs of Rocky are not actually organs in a biological sense like you and I have. Instead, these organs are built by the worker cells to serve a purpose. The same can be said for Rocky's brain, or really any Iridian. They will build these structures, at least the worker cells will, that will then allow them to think. The colony will have some of the cells that will then specialize in some other tasks, such as being responsible for upkeep of an inorganic brain, or maybe the muscle. That really actually isn't a muscle, which we will discuss, or the secretion of the shell. All of these inorganic structures are formed and maintained by the biological matter that lives within Rocky. So what does that really look like? As we follow the internal worker cells of Rocky, what we would see is that these connections would be made neurologically speaking, I guess you could say, just with a different medium being used. So let's frame it this way. One cell is at the top of the body and would like the lower portion of the body to move. Specialized inorganic matter is communicated through that then informs the other cells to start the process of moving by utilizing the circulatory system. You can kind of think of this similar to how maybe a landline works. Sound waves are turned into electrical energy that then becomes sound waves once reaching the target. The cells communicate with inorganic material that then on the other side relays a message to the cells that they can then interpret. Or, in a human way of thinking about it, the electrical information of nerves can be turned into movement of maybe a robotic limb. But this is fundamentally how the worker cells communicate. These internal structures, such as the crystalline brain, are quite interesting as it's sort of like human white matter versus gray matter. Our gray matter, which is the area where processing actually takes place in our brain, that's what's mostly going to give us thought. And this would be the worker cells in terms of Rocky's brain. The white matter is simply there mostly for communication, which allows for different areas of the brain to talk to one another, and these are the inorganic areas of Rocky's brain. All of this is great concerning neurologically, but how is that actually keeping Rocky alive? Well, internally to his body, he has the exoskeleton providing support and protection from the hostile environment. Internally also exists more inorganic structures. A metallic bone structure will actually span the limbs and central thorax, providing internal support as well. But what's really weird is his blood. Again, the thing to remember about this is mostly they're non-living structures. So basically, Rocky is kind of a car, and the extreme heat of his planet requires not only a radiator, but the need for fuel as well, and a way to transport that. And given its inorganic structures doing it, well, things that might be highly poisonous for any other cell, or at least humanity, can actually exist quite peacefully within Rocky with literally zero issues as long as it's maintained. When we look at blood of an Iridian, there are actually two circulatory systems. These operate less like a human circulatory system and really more like plumbing to conduct heat exchange. Like the radiator as mentioned and the fuel. One is relatively a cool system which supports his actual life, like nutrients and cells and exchange of gases and all that good stuff. And the other is superheated, and that one actually helps him move. The blood is essentially liquid mercury. Within that mercury are dissolved metals that can then be used to repair his body given the inorganic nature of Rocky himself. So, let's begin with a more life-supporting circulatory system first. This is known as the ambient circulatory system. It is actually cooler by comparison, which makes the Iridian species actually somewhat cold-blooded. The temperature of their world permeates their entire body, keeping them at around 410 degrees Fahrenheit. Within this system flowing around the body, worker cells are found, and this system is actually tasked with several jobs. The life of Rocky is contained here, so to speak. Nutrients are moved to different areas and cells down the line. Metabolic waste is filtered out. Structures that function, such as the limbs, can be comparatively cooled to prevent overheating and damage to the worker cells in this area, and should they be damaged, the system is responsible for actually starting the process of healing. The system passes through literal radiators in the body, pulling heat from the actual circulatory system and then dumping it into the surrounding area. Sort of like how heat from our body can be pulled up to the skin during heavy activity by using our blood and then dumped off into the atmosphere with sweat aiding in this process. The same thing happens to the Iridians, just with a literal dedicated radiator, probably several of them, all over their body. The second circulatory system is a much more hostile and inorganic one. Here you will find virtually no worker cells because that is not what it's actually for, and this is known as the hot circulatory system, or HCS. The blood volume is smaller because you technically do not want that getting too large, as it would induce overheating quite quickly. The temperature gets up to around 305 degrees Celsius or 581 degrees in bald eagle units. The Iridian worker cell cannot actually survive this temperature, but it serves a critical purpose. Well, technically, it serves many, but in this case, the main reason is to actually move Rocky's limbs. The HCS will act as a hydraulic system of sorts, or like a steam engine. Basically, how we move machines that are inorganic, same principle applies here. Because some liquids are difficult to actually, a lot of them are difficult to compress. The forces that act on a solid object and then move them. Mercury providing the heat because you can sink a lot of heat into it, but then water also being the other big one. By using these fluids that are superheated, the energy can then be transferred that then allows for movement of the limbs and body. Basically, again, Rocky is a steam engine, which, as we know, this is partially how his body moves in the first place. But then Roanoke, I can hear you asking. How is this temperature maintained if it's so much higher than the atmosphere of the planet? Well, this is why Rocky is only partially cold-blooded, because really, he relies on heat generation as well. Much like how mammals dunk on our atmosphere all the time and produce our own heat, with blackjack and hookers, even if it's cold outside, the hot circulatory system of his body would think that the 410 degree temps of Erid would be absolutely frigid, Within the Iridians is a structure affectionately called the spleen. The HCS will get its heat energy from this area. Well, yeah, okay, that's actually a good way of saying it. Pooling in this inorganic structure, you can kind of think of it like a pot of water on a gas stove. Heat energy from the fire heats the pot, which then is transferred into the water in the pot. With Iridians, the nutrition that they consume feeds the biological side of their body or the colony that exists within. That will then allow them, or allow any of them really, to think, act, and keep the hot circulatory system going. This gradient allows for movement of energy, which gradients of energy are pretty much the only thing that causes anything to work. If the if the universe does the big freeze, that basically means all energy has been homogenized across the whole thing, and that also means at that point, nothing can happen, because all energy is the same, nothing's moving. Also, they just found out the other day that given the fact that when we look back 10 billion years into the actual the universe, we're finding galaxies that shouldn't have existed around that time or even been able to form yet. Basically, a couple of things that may have happened with that. Either our entire universe is in a black hole, which is possible, and we're actually looking out the front of the black hole, being like, well, that's weird that that's there, or possibly our entire understanding of the Big Bang is just wrong, and things happen a lot quicker than we thought they should. Either way, that has nothing to do with this, but just know, gradient of energy is what moves everything. So the specialized worker cells that upkeep the hot circulatory system will then heat up the spleen, superheating the material, which is the mercury, which in turn will allow for the movement of the body itself. So what would this process look like? Well, in order to contract this muscle, the ACS would reduce flow near it, as this would cause it to heat up well beyond its limit, cooking the worker cells, which is not great. The hot circulatory system then gets involved as its own presence increases. Heat will transfer to the vesicles that are filled with likely water, given that there is water on their planet. This heat will in turn cause the water to turn into a vapor as the vesicles are then pushed outwards. This will create what is functionally a biological piston. After the expansion is no longer needed, the hot circulatory system recedes, and then the ambient circulatory system returns once more. It will then remove the heat, taking it back down to a balmy 410 degrees Fahrenheit or 210 Celsius, and this in turn will basically cause it to go back to liquid water, allowing for the vesicle to shrink as the muscle relaxes. The heat is then whisked away to the radiators to be vented out into the environment. Of course, that's a lot of lost heat, so nutrition is consumed in order to replace the heat lost by heating it up in the spleen. Now, this process sounds like it would take a really, really long time, but you have to remember, in terms of biology, these things happen quick enough, like our muscles contraction seem instantaneous to us, but the process of actually contracting the muscle, I mean, if you think about it, is not all that instantaneous. So it's the same for them. It's just a process that happens extremely quick, and the cycling of heat is how they move. But there are other measures in order to retain heat as well, because they do need to do it inside of their body, otherwise there's a problem. The ambient system will contain glass-like structures in order to direct the flow of its fluids for its circulatory system. But these are actually composed of what are known as sodium silicate, which I can hear you now. Roanoke, those are rigid. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They are, in fact, very rigid. Actually, they will snap if bent. However, at the limb bending areas, they then branch out to make thousands of capillaries, so just the smaller ones that then become like a bundle. This means they can bend without snapping because they don't move that much relative to the limb moving, as only a small amount of movement takes place. It's kind of ingenious, but it's a pretty sick adaptation for an issue that should absolutely cause an explosion in their limb and then an immediate bleed out. Meanwhile, the hot circulatory system has to be insulated heavily in order to create this heat gradient, which then allows for the survival of the iridian in the first place. If this didn't exist, it would actually be similar to a seizure in a human. The muscles would stay extended, and the water in the body would be superheated, and the worker cells would be taken out by their own system, which is not great. So it's actually surrounded by a polycrystalline structure that is said to be composed of sodium, calcium, with CO2 and O4 attached. And to handle all this, 5 hearts exist within the body, 1 per limb that helps pump both of these. The flow kind of works like this: central body to limb heart to outward limb area to the most distal tissues, as then the capillaries will return that back to the thorax, keeping it all moving. So also, let's talk about it for a moment, given that, Rocky actually has a mate, Adrian. The thing to know is that there are essentially female worker cells and there are male worker cells, which that's what creates the difference between Adrian and Rocky. But they both lay eggs. That's the other part of that. So these eggs that they're laying actually contain their own worker cells, and as they are very close together, those will exchange genetic information, meaning that, some of them born will be male, some of them born will be female, just depending on which cell is, I guess, displaying its own genes. So really, fundamentally, there is no sexual dimorphism, I believe, in this species. It appears that they are both the same. It's just one's going to be, just for the sake of argument, given that it's male and female, one will be XX and one will be XY. And then the eggs that they produce will then, like I said, touch each other. And at that point, well, you have it going to be one way or another. Is it going to be a female rock creature or is it going to be a male rock creature? But finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is how their sleep works, because clearly it is different from ours. The prevailing question here is, why? Why do they pass out? And why are they in so much danger? Well, if we take into account everything we've just learned about the heat gradient, then it becomes clear as to why they need to be immobilized completely. The body requires upkeep, but there are no-go zones while it is standardly operating for these worker cells. Getting too close to the HCS would in turn cause immense problems for the worker cells because they would die. What I believe we are seeing with the shutdown is basically the worker cells aware there is damage to these systems and a need to go in and repair the tissue that not only allows for them to move, but the system that allows for the heat to be utilized as it is. This presents an interesting challenge, however, for them biologically. If the body is immobile and chooses to be immobile, this means that the system can be activated before the repairs are complete. So what do you do then? Well, given the inorganic nature of the brain itself, what I believe happens is Rocky's consciousness simply goes elsewhere. The cells move away from the communication through those structures, which means he is fundamentally checked out, but his cells are still alive. It's sort of like a coma, or anesthesia is the best way to put it. Your cells are still there, they're just not talking to each other anymore. Like, your brain is still active in areas, even under anesthesia, but the areas of your brain cannot communicate. But he has entered a comatose state just like that. With no communication, the worker cells then move away from that area and into other areas of the body. It is likely around this time some valve for the spleen is then shut. After some time, the HCS then downstream of the spleen will cool off, likely through activity of the ACS, as the heat is then dumped into the surrounding environment. This in turn will cause the body to ambiently cool to 410 degrees. It is at this point that the worker cells can then move in and repair all the damaged structures of the body. They will then be able to enter the HCS as the temperature has dramatically dropped, where internal to the vessels, they can then be fixed. Vesicles forming the muscle, or at least muscle movement, can be repaired, and any damage to the outside layers can also be secreted, resealing any of the areas that may have been breached. And this does several things. First, their sleeping is an unavoidable process. When the worker cells decide too much damage has been incurred, signals will start being sent to one another, where Rocky will interpret this as sleep is coming. And they are right. Once the shutdown has happened, given the cells are not communicating through the neurological structures, and there is no contraction happening because the gradient has been ceased, the cells have no idea what's happening outside, which makes them completely susceptible to danger, which is why they must watch one another as they sleep. This temperature gradient, being mostly lost, allows for the worker cells to access every part of the body, apart from the spleen, which even then, that may either be turned down or potentially even stopped entirely, because those cells that are heating it up may just completely leave it alone. It's like moving into an industrial oven in order to repair it. It's not on, so it's safe to enter. However, working on it while it is turned on would cook any person trying to do it. Once enough repairs are made, in Rocky's case, the carapace is resealed after its experience in Earth's atmosphere, it's likely that entering his pod, it would probably maybe be cooler than it's supposed to be. So this may have actually begun to actually induce hypothermia in Rocky, which would then slow repair time, or it could even kill him. However, with the addition of the heat lamp that Grace creates, he was able to raise the temperature in that enclosure to near arid temps, allowing for the repair attempt to be successful. And again, given the structures are all inorganic, the minerals applied by the worker cells themselves are what are going to be expended. Upon waking up, it is very likely that an Iridian would be extremely hungry and would need to eat, not only to restore the HCS more completely, but also to replace the lost minerals their body would have used in order to repair themselves. The Iridian biology is one built off tremendous hostilities, at least by human standards. So much so that multicellularism never really truly arose, and instead colonies of cells would continue their pathway before finally achieving the ability to shape inorganic matter around themselves. Very likely, at the beginning, they were actually just rocks, until new adaptations would arise, allowing for these rocks to be contracted in certain ways by creating a heat gradient, which then allowed movement. And over time, this would basically be like what a clamshell was, except they turn into a sapient, highly social species that would be able to form bonds with humans, given our own social ability. Truly, amaze, amaze, amaze. But anyhow, I hope you enjoyed learning about Rocky's biology today. If you did enjoy, then please leave a like and a comment. YouTube, I've been saying this a lot, but they really did. They switched to AI back in May. And now it only reads comments, likes, and any form of metric going to be subscribing to help out this at all. So if you aren't subscribed and you do like this stuff, go ahead and subscribe. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Roanoke Tales, and Instagram links down in the description. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. At the Astronaut tier, we have Army and Teacher. Thank you guys for your awesome continued support. At the Astrophysicist tier, we have Desk Dancer, Webtron Supreme, and Eddie the Iggy. Thank you guys as well. And also, now at the Scientist tier, we have the Chat of Chuds, Metric System, Invictus Echo, Official Texan, SSJ4 Lotus, and Gina Lane. Thank you guys as well. And the rest of my patrons, I really do appreciate y'all's support as well. It keeps things running around here and is greatly appreciated. I am live streaming to members now. I think we're doing Subnautica 2. Some people got mad about that because I wasn't playing it on regular. Something to know about the YouTube algorithm. If you live stream, at least back in the day, it would hurt your channel immensely. I'm kind of testing out to see if that's true or not, because I don't mind live streaming to people who aren't members. I just know keeping it as members basically prevents your channel from destroying itself. So if it ends up being an issue, I can always post over on, I believe it's Roanoke Games. That's my other channel. I haven't posted there in a while, but you know, it is what it is. Anyways, that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.